And sound test number 1. Okay, sound test number 2. Sound test number 3. Okay, looking good. Okay, folks, that voice that you're hearing is me. Just give me a sec here while I fiddle with our settings behind the scenes. Okay, all right, welcome, folks. Welcome back to Nature Talks. So it's July 6th, and tonight, I guess, it's 7 p.m., though it doesn't really feel like it because it's super sunny out now. We are learning about coastal barrens. So if it's your first time here, I'm Becky Parker. I'm the coordinator from Nature Nova Scotia. Also have Emma Bocking, who's our volunteer, and we have Jeremy Lundholm with us, who's going to tell us all about coastal barrens today, just on the other end of my virtual screen here. So you have the opportunity to ask questions today. So if you're familiar with YouTube, you probably see at the very bottom or over at the right, you've got a chat there you can stick your questions into. If you're having trouble hearing, seeing us, if you have a lag, try restarting or just refreshing your window. Sometimes that helps. We'll try to go a little slow when we get to the end and we're answering all of your questions, just to give everybody time to catch up. But if worst case scenario, you're having a lot of trouble, we will be recording and saving our presentation to the YouTube channel, so you'll be able to see it all later. Yeah, so today's pretty casual. If you're friendly, say hi in the chat. Tell us where you're tuning in from tonight. And yeah, with that, I can turn the virtual floor over to Jeremy. So Jeremy, welcome, and thank you so much for being here. Do you want to start off by just telling us a bit about yourself and why you like coastal barrens so much?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start sharing my screen while I do that.
Great.
So, yeah, my name's Jeremy Lundholm. I live in Halifax. I'm a professor at St. Mary's University, and I've been working on coastal barrens as part of my research for almost 18 years, I guess. So it's been a while. And they're like my favorite habitat in the province. Like I said, I do research on these, but we also spend a lot of time out there with my family hiking, just because for Halifax, there's some wonderful coastal barrens that are really close by, and I'm going to show you some pictures of those, while including this one here, which is just Duncan's Cove Nature Reserve on the Duncan's Cove side, just from a couple weeks ago, actually. So we spend a lot of time out there, and sometimes it's research and sometimes it's recreation. So I am a plant researcher, so I'm really focused on the plants, but there's a ton of other biodiversity out there on the barrens. And if you have questions about that, ask me. But really, this talk is just about the plants and I guess the habitat in general. So I've got a few slides to share with you. There's not too much technical stuff, and I'll try not to do much of that. When I moved out here, the word on the street was there's basically 3 different kinds of barrens in Nova Scotia, or 3 different regions that had barrens. First, there's the Highland Barrens, which are really restricted to northern Cape Breton, and again, they're high elevation. And I'm not going to talk too much about those. I'll kind of go through these. They're pretty special. They have some extreme conditions, and I'll talk about that in a sec. Then we've got our inland barrens, and essentially these are barren areas, so areas of vegetation without forests, but these are inland, so they're generally at least 2 kilometers inland. And there's a bunch of these in southwestern Nova Scotia, and they're scattered throughout the mainland as well, and there's a few in Cape Breton too. But today I'm going to focus on coastal barrens, because that's where most of my research has been, and that's where a lot of the nature reserves in the province that contain barrens are largely on the coast. So places like Peggy's Cove, Polly's Cove, Chebucto Head, Duncan's Cove, that area, Prospect. There's tons, and they go all the way from. It's mostly Atlantic coast that has the coastal barrens. There's not a lot on the Fundy Shore. That's a whole bunch of different habitats. But these go all the way up into Cape Breton as well. So let's just get into those differences a little bit. The thing about the Highland Barrens, if you've been up there, it's very, very, very windy. They've got les souettes. They've got some coastal conditions as well. Even high up, you can get fog. I can never figure out if I'm in a cloud or it's fog from the ocean or both, but it doesn't really matter. The trick is it's a pretty harsh environment for plants to grow in. And so essentially what we have, especially at the top of these highland areas, like above the tree line, is a tundra kind of vegetation. And true to its name, we actually have a bunch of species in the Highland Barrens that are essentially Arctic or alpine species that typically would be found at much higher elevations, like in the mountains, or much higher latitudes, like way up in the Arctic. So that's pretty cool. There's a lot of rare plants. There's, all that kind of stuff too. But again, they're not the focus of the talk today. But there's lots of great ones. A bunch of them are in Cape Breton Highlands National Park, of course. So many of these are protected, which is great. The inland barrens are much less protected. So we don't have as many nature reserves that contain these. And essentially, these show up in special circumstances where there's sand. So sand barrens are really common. And I should say, that's one of the common types of inland barrens, is basically it's so dry that it prevents trees from taking over, and it's very fire prone. So you get fires that will basically periodically take out the trees that are there. At least that's the natural disturbance regime, or the natural, the way that these habitats maintain themselves. And that's the same for the rocky inland barrens as well. And there's some of these even around Halifax. Maybe they're not really coastal, but a lot of these are in southwestern Nova Scotia. And again, they're in an extreme part of the landscape. They're up on ridges. The glaciers, 10,000 years ago or more, scraped most of the till and the loose material off there. So there's not much soil, and it's very difficult for there to be a lot of productivity. And so trees do grow there. But because the soil is so shallow, it's very dry. So you get lots of fires, right? And so this kind of barren, both kinds of inland barrens, we think they're maintained by fire. I'll show you some of that evidence in a few slides. But so here we are, coastal barrens. So this picture is from part of the Duncan's Cove Nature Reserve, which, again, being one of the closest to Halifax, gets a lot of foot traffic. So there's lots of hiking trails and things like that. And again, from a research side, it's very close to St. Mary's where I work. So we've done so many studies at this site and fewer at other sites. But one of the things I was supposed to say when I showed you that map is that, so barrens are all over the province, but they only make up less than 3% of the land area. So they're kind of special. They're basically everywhere else. The natural vegetation would be forest and different kinds of wetlands. And so these are special. A good number of coastal barrens are protected, like I said, and so that's really good. But there's a bunch of other ones, and I'll mention some later, that aren't protected, and there are threats to these barrens as well. So coastal barrens typically occur within a couple kilometers of the coast. They are influenced by coastal conditions like wind and fog. So they tend to be not hot and dry like the inland barrens, but cool and wet. They also get salt, right? So very close to the coast, there's so much salt spray that it essentially washes the rocks clean, and you get this special vegetation type that just grows there. But farther inland, you get these shrublands. And so most of the plants that make up the dominant vegetation on barrens are shrubs. Some of them are tiny. Some of them are only, a couple inches high. But they're still shrubs because they're woody plants. They have, the part that survives over the winter, part of that is above ground. So just like a tree, essentially. But so these are considered shrublands. They're similar to habitats in Europe that people call heathlands. And so we consider these to be heathlands as well. And all a heathland is a barren or a shrubland, not a lot of trees, but dominated by shrubs that are in the heath family, which is the blueberry family, right? So blueberries, cranberries, all kinds of berries. Crowberries as well are now counted in that family. And I'll talk a lot about crowberry because that's one of my favorite plants. And it's really one of the dominant types of plants that you'll find on coastal barrens. So there's also Arctic alpine species that live on these barrens, not as many as up in the highlands, but so it's a pretty interesting habitat. I got into this because I study biodiversity, specifically plant diversity. So we're really interested in, why these areas have so many plant species in them. When you go onto the barrens, some areas will have very few plant species. So it'll just be like a carpet of black crowberry, for example. And other areas, like this one pictured here, could have, 10, 20 different plant species all in the same little area, right? So part of the scientific, question that I'm trying to get at is, well, why are some areas diverse and why are some areas not diverse? But if you go to a barren like Duncan's Cove, the whole site will have hundreds of plant species. So the barrens in general are quite diverse. Within that, there's some variation. What we found, so we've been studying these for many years, and one of the things we found is that the areas like this one here that tend to have the most plant species are wetter. And a lot of these are essentially they're bog species, so they're wetland species. You can see a pitcher plant flower on the left here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I know we're going through a couple different platforms here. There's another one on the other side. Dragon's mouth or dragon's head, Arethusa, a bog orchid. There's also this interesting sedge. It's a tussock sedge, Scirpus cespitosus, Trichophorum cespitosus, deer grass, that's what we call it. And this is really an Arctic species as well. I should say it's found from here and farther north, but it really becomes more dominant up in the Arctic or subarctic where it's, where it's wet and things like that. So we've got, one of the other reasons the barrens are so diverse is that it's not just one habitat. If you go to a site like Duncan's Cove, you can see these rocky ridges, which have their own types of plants. So I'll show you some pictures of those. You've got these depressions where the wetlands occur. So you get little bits of bogs in there. Sometimes you get true bogs, like a real wetland that could be, a hectare or more in size. It's all part of the Barrens matrix. You get slopes, you get little valleys where you get trees in more sheltered areas. You can see some of this at Polly's Cove if you ever hike out there. Yeah, so it's interesting. One of the other reasons these habitats are so diverse in Nova Scotia is that, like I said, we've got these species that are more common in the north of Canada, like Arctic species, but we've also got species that are coming in that have come from the south. So species that are more temperate, that like warmer climates, and a lot of these reach their northern limit on our barrens. And I'll show you, well, at least one picture though. And so you get this great combination of like boreal species, Arctic species, and southern, not tropical, believe me, but temperate zone species all living together, just because it's basically their ranges overlap nicely in our province here. So that's great. So that's part of that story. So here's a close-up of some of these bog plants. So this would be the bog laurel. Very nice. And you can see some crowberries. This is close up. In the dry, rocky areas, you don't get as many plant species. There's just not as many species out there that can handle these conditions in this province. But we do have some nice ones. This is the three-toothed cinquefoil, Subaldia tridentata. So it's related to potentillas and things like that. Very nice plant. We actually grow this on our green roofs at St. Mary's as well. It's a really tough plant. And if you give it just a little bit of soil on top of a roof, that's a wonderful, native plant for a green roof as well. There's also, I don't know if you can see this, it's probably very small on your screen. I can barely see it here. I actually didn't notice this till just a minute ago, but this is probably pretty close to the coast. I don't remember taking this picture. It's probably 15 years old. And this is a seaside plantain, this little one. And this only occurs in the salt spray zone, right? What's happening now with sea level rise is what we call the salt spray zone, which is that sort of rocky area right by the coast where it doesn't have, mostly what you see from the distance is rock instead of, the continuous vegetation that we see on most of the barrens. Sea level rise is basically pushing species like this seaside plantain, which is a native species, is pushing it inland, and it's kind of eating away at the more of the rock barren, sort of inland rock barren plants and the heath plants. It's a natural process. I'm sure if sea level was dropping, the opposite would happen. The heath would be extending towards the ocean, but this is going to be interesting. On sites where there's not as much space, like for example, if there's a road, we call that coastal squeeze, because essentially the plant communities are trying to move inland as sea level rises, as these salt tolerant species are basically going to take over from the heathland species. But if we don't allow enough space for the heathland species to move inland, we're going to lose them. So that's a coastal squeeze issue that we see on some of our coastline in any case. Luckily, a lot of these nature reserves that have some of our best barrens are quite broad, and so there's a lot of space for them to expand inland. So it's not really an issue at those sites, but it could be at unprotected sites. One of the things that we've done in the last 10 years is actually classify the vegetation on barrens, which has been fun. It wasn't my first choice to do as a project, but I have a couple of partners working on this, Caitlin Porter and Sean Basquel, and we finally published our classification. So I'm going to talk very briefly about this. This actually tells us how many distinct vegetation communities, so sets of plants that, or plant species that tend to co-occur in the same set of conditions. So you can see here, this is sort of a, just by the different colors, it's a mosaic of different habitats, and each color really represents a different type of vegetation. And so we were able to figure out, well, how many types do we have in Nova Scotia? Why do we do this? It helps with conservation, and it helps in a bunch of different ways as well. Not just the species inventory, which we already had, but actually a vegetation community inventory, because then we can start to look at, well, which types of communities of plants are actually rare, and how do we preserve those? That whole thing. So that's been fun. You could see here the sort of what I call the mosaic nature of a lot of our coastal barrens. They're very rocky. One of the questions I sometimes get asked is, okay, well, mostly, in some parts of Nova Scotia, the forest goes right up to the beach. There'll be a thin line of, rocky coastal habitat or beach habitat or maybe salt marsh, but all the rest is forest. So why do we get barrens in some areas and forest in others? And the short answer is we're not 100% sure. But what we do see, at least on the Atlantic coast, is the areas where there's a lot of bedrock near the surface, you get barrens. And the areas where it's like a nice drumlin, like around Lawrencetown, for example, on either side of the beach, you've got drumlins. That's basically glacial till. So it's softer materials, it's finer materials, it's gravel, and soil can build up very easily. And that's where you get the forests. If you burn that forest down, you might get a coastal barren for a little while, but it'll turn back into a forest. On sites like this one, and I don't remember which one this is. This might be part of Polly's Cove. It looks kind of like it, but I'm not 100% sure. There's so many of these sites. What you do see on these sites is you'll get trees growing in the valleys where it's sheltered. So the whole site isn't a barren. Again, it's this mosaic, and depending on the environmental conditions, you'll get a different type of vegetation. But you can really see the rocks, right? And so the rocks are interesting too, because some of them are glacial erratics. Some of them is literally just bedrock that you can't move, that's just stuck there. But what the rock does, it's not uniform, right? It's not a nice flat surface. So what happens is in between the rocks, you get areas where soil builds up, and you get different plants than you get on top of the rocks. There's overlap, but yeah, that whole thing. There's a lot of lichens and mosses that live on barrens as well. Again, because they're wide open, there's not a lot of shade, especially in the open rocks. It's a perfect place for lichens. And a number of these species are rare as well. And so our barrens are doing a good job of preserving these species. One of my students found a lichen, this is 10 years ago now, on one of the rocks at Duncan's Cove Nature Reserve that had never been reported before from North America. It's an Arctic species that had been found in Europe, but here it is in Nova Scotia. It's been here all along, as far as we know, but no one had looked. And so if you want to look, you can find some interesting stuff there. So some of the other interesting plants that we get on the barrens, are things like broom crowberry. So I talk about crowberries because I love them. I think they're such cool plants. If you get out onto the Barrens in the summer, especially, and you take a sniff, there's a sort of spicy, almost like a cinnamon type of smell. And this is on inland barrens as well. As long as you've got crowberries, all of the crowberry species make that scent. It's just a volatile organic compound that they release from their leaves. They probably make it to protect themselves from maybe fungal attack or insects that eat them, that kind of thing. But we can enjoy it. The other nice smelling plants on the barrens are things like juniper and bayberry are very common on coastal barrens. And so it's a wonderful, it's a great sensory environment. Of course, I can't convey that to you through Zoom, but if you get out there and you can figure out which are the ones that smell nice just by sticking your head right in it. Just be careful of the juniper because they're sharp, some of them. But broom crowberry is a really interesting plant because it's actually really rare everywhere except Nova Scotia. So we have like the most of it. It's not even, we can't get funding to study it in Nova Scotia because it's so common. It doesn't qualify for species at risk or anything like that. Whereas down in the States, very much it's uncommon or critically endangered in some of these regions. And this is an example of a plant that mainly has, like most of its original distribution is farther south than us. So this is a temperate species, whereas the other crowberries are more like boreal or even Arctic species that come down. And we have four species of crowberries in the province, and this is just one of them. And this is one of the ones that will occur inland as well as on the coast, and it seems to respond well to fire. So that's what allows it to be dominant on the inland barrens. I know you can't read this. I'm just showing you. This is an example. This is like one page from our classification manual, just to give you a flavor of what it looks like. But essentially each type of habitat. So this one, it's got a code DS6, but the name of it is Black Crowberry Mesic Coastal Barren. Mesic just means that it's kind of in between wet and dry. It's not super wet. It's not super dry either. And this is one of our most common vegetation types on the coastal barrens, at least on the Atlantic side. It's got a lot of plant species that live there. It takes advantage of the cool, wet conditions, but it's not the same as our wetland, our bog conditions, our bog habitats and things like that. So that's a fun one. This is Black Crowberry right here, and this is a great example of that Black Crowberry habitat that we have a lot of. So I said earlier that the barrens are shrublands. And that's because most of, if you throw a shovel and it lands on your barrens, it's most likely going to hit shrubs. Now, these are dwarf shrubs. A lot of people think they're mosses because crowberries often only grow about 5 to 10 centimeters high. They're very low growing. On exposed rocks, they'll be even shorter and they'll just creep along the surface of the rock. They're very well adapted to these conditions. And we think they love the fog as well. But I wanted to point out, the reason I put this photo up is that there are herbaceous species as well, wildflowers like, this is the white goldenrod, and there's a bunch of them. But in the crowberry habitats, they tend to just pop up here and there. They're not the dominants, and they may occur on the sides of trails where the crowberries have been kind of beaten back by the trail, that kind of thing. So you see that. On the right here, this is actually a flowering plant. I know it looks like a moss or a club moss, but crowberries are flowering plants. They're related to blueberries, and they have these tiny, tiny little flowers. It's too late to see these now because this picture was taken in April 7th, many years ago, but April 7th down at Kedgie Seaside Annex, and you can actually see it flowering. So it does have these cute little flowers with 3 petals. We think flies might pollinate them. We're not sure. They do seem to be insect pollinated. Anything with colorful petals generally is trying to attract some kind of insect or bird to pollinate it. So these are all part of the mystery of coastal barrens. We still don't know a lot about how these plants work, but this is a really cool plant. And like I said, it smells nice. It's useful. I've been told that Indigenous people up in Labrador, I believe it's the Inuit communities on the coast of Labrador, actually use crowberry. They cut sods and they use it to smoke fish, and I bet it imparts a really good flavor. I don't know whether that same use has been is historic for Nova Scotia as well, but definitely it was something that people use this for. You can eat the berries. If anyone's eaten crowberries, like they're okay, but if there's blueberries around, you're going to eat the blueberries. One thing I will say though about these coastal barren sites, a lot of them are dominated by huckleberry, and that's a great plant for foraging. Like huckleberries are awesome. So I got to remember to go out in August and collect some this year. In winter, you can also enjoy the coastal barrens. This is January 1st, about 3 years ago. Martinique Beach, if you walk along the whole beach, you get to some coastal barrens right at the headland. And a number of the evergreen shrubs like crowberry and like the junipers, they're evergreen, so they keep their leaves on over the winter, but they don't stay green. They turn other colors, right? So the junipers will turn this frosty, kind of like a silvery bluish color, or even brown, or whatever. Crowberries can turn all kinds of colors. They often turn purplish. Here, there's a whole rainbow, and we're just lucky to be there at the right time to see this. But so definitely winter's a great time to visit barrens. The other thing I should say about visiting the coastal barrens in summer is that because there's not a lot of tree cover, and because they're close to the coast, they tend not to be very buggy, right? There's always wind blowing the bugs away. So, for hikers, that's great. So that's probably one of the reasons I hike there so often. Doing the classification work, some of the data that we collect to try to figure out, okay, what type of vegetation is this? Is it different from this other type that looks different over here? We look at what species of plants are there, of course, but we also look at the environment. And one of the key things is the soil. All right. So what kinds of soils are on, underneath the vegetation? And I'm not going to talk about soil today, but when we're digging pits of soil to find out what kind of soil is there, you can find charcoal in the soil. And this is evidence that that particular site has experienced a wildfire at some point in its history. We haven't actually figured out when these fires were. Sometimes you can do that. There's carbon date. There's ways of doing that. We haven't done that. But what it tells us, and here we've broken down a little bit of data for you into, the three main types of barrens, like I said at the beginning: highland, inland, and coastal, just to see, how much, are these, do we need fires to maintain barrens in Nova Scotia? And certainly most of the inland barrens have evidence of charcoal in their soil. And so it's pretty likely that these are fire systems, meaning that if we don't allow them to burn, eventually they will become forested. And a lot of those interesting plants, and including some rare species, will be lost from the system. So fire is important for inland barrens. When you get down to the coast, coastal barrens can burn. There's definitely areas that have burned in the past, but the vast majority of them, there's no evidence that wildfire is common or has happened historically. So in these cases, we think that these barrens, at least some of them, persist on their own. They don't need some kind of disturbance periodically. The environment's so harsh that it prevents forest from taking over. So that's the idea. It's a little bit of ecology there. So we do have this idea that some barrens are persistent, so they're maintained by harsh climate conditions, but other barrens might be dynamic. And what that means is that, if a disturbance comes along, and this could be a fire, you'll get a barren, but eventually over time, over 100 years or so, these aren't fast growing plants, over 100 years or so, a forest will creep back in until the next time a disturbance comes. And in some sites, we have evidence that there's actually two different kinds of barrens at the same site. So closer to the coast, the more exposed locations we think are persistent. So they're not going to build up a lot of fuel load. So they're very unlikely to have a wildfire. Closer to the coast, you get more wet conditions, and you get more, basically cooler, wetter conditions. Whereas even on the same site, like somewhere like Polly's Cove, if you go inland, some of those inland parts have burned. And there's actually evidence that forest has been encroaching on the open barrens over the last 100 years. We know this because we've looked at old aerial photos, and we've actually seen areas of barrens shrinking, essentially. And I'll show you a map right here. that gives you a little bit more sense of how this works or how this might work. I had a student who was really keen on getting a drone to get some aerial pictures. So this is basically drone photography. This was flown at about 90 meters, I think, and they take hundreds of pictures, and then the computer knits them all together into a single image like this, and then we process them to classify the vegetation that's here, and you get a map like what you see on the left here. The only I know you can't read the stuff down below here, but basically each color is a different type of vegetation or water. So I think that deep blue is water. But mapping it in this way really allows us to get a sense of what might be happening over time on these systems. I'll point out a couple colors. We actually have we have a different version of this that's colorblind friendly, but this one looks a bit better in the presentation. So I apologize if blue and green and red look similar to anyone because they're important on this. But so the blue and green, basically the green is tree islands, right? And what we've shown in the past is that some of these tree islands are expanding over time on the Barrens. And eventually we want to know what's going to happen. What a map like this shows us is what kinds of habitats are next to the forest islands, right? The blue here is a tall shrubland. And so it's not your little crowberries. It's things like wild raisin. It's things like wild holly, some of the service berries, tall shrubs. They're hard to walk through. No one likes hiking through that unless there's a nice trail. But it looks like that's the forest is expanding into those areas. And you kind of get the sense that this is a river valley, and it totally is. This is part of Polly's Cove, actually. Yeah, and I think that's where that other picture was taken from that I showed you earlier. And it just shows that the trees and the tall shrub communities are concentrated in areas that are sheltered topographically, right? If you're up on top of a ridge, it's way less fun to be a tree. The wind is going to really nail you in the winter, especially if there's no snow cover. And so that's why trees on barrens grow in sheltered areas, and they can expand out of there. And in a dynamic barren, they will expand until a disturbance knocks them back into their sheltered area. So we've learned a little bit about the dynamics of barrens. There's a lot more to learn, but now I want to talk about conservation, and I'm almost done. But so many of you have heard of Owl's Head, and that's a coastal barren site. Many years ago, 10 years ago, I think we were doing classification work all across the province, and this just happened to be one of the sites that we studied. And luckily, when this became an issue, when the province delisted it, it was supposed to be a provincial park reserve. You probably know all about this. It was delisted many years after we did the study, but luckily we still had that data. So we've been using this in the case to preserve Owl's Head, the data that we have. This graph is not going to mean a lot to many of you, but what we found at Owl's Head is that in terms of plant species, it was one of the richer sites. So it was comparable to some of our most species-rich barren sites like Polly's Cove and Chebucto Head that have a ton of different types of vegetation and lots of species that make up these different types of vegetation. So high on the list for plant diversity. It's also really high on what I can call environmental diversity. So a range of different conditions at that site. If you've been out there, you know that it's got these rocky ridges that, you can see it on this aerial photo, right? They're parallel ridges, and the glaciers have scraped through there. So the tops of the ridges have very little soil, but the bottoms have these little wetland communities, and a whole bunch of them repeating through the site. So it's a pretty cool site. That kind of topography is pretty unique. There are a couple other barren sites in the province that have that, but none of them are protected. And so this is a really unique site. It's a really important site. So obviously, in terms of threats to coastal barrens, putting a golf course into one is going to completely destroy the barrens. Obviously, like you either have to blast the rock and get rid of it, or fill in the wetlands in between the rock ridges. Anyway, it's crazy. But in other barrens, one of the other threats, and we keep seeing this has been a persistent threat for many years, is off-highway vehicle traffic. People like to drive in the barrens because it's not a forest. You can just drive around wherever you want. especially in the wetlands. Um, these can be very sensitive areas. These ruts, you can actually see these if you look at Polly's Cove, certain parts of that site, which is near Peggy's Cove, you can see them on Google Maps. On the satellite view, they're prominent enough that you can see the tracks. It only takes driving through one of these once to leave a track that might take, 40 years to repair itself, essentially. So this is something we don't really want to see. Some of our early work, we actually contributed to the legislation that bans off-highway vehicles from coastal barrens. It doesn't matter whether that coastal barren is protected officially as a nature reserve or not. That legislation that came out in 2006 bans ATVs from all coastal barrens. So we tried, it's just hard to keep them off. So I talked briefly about mosses and lichens. They're one of the, if you're a photographer, lichens are amazing. If you've got a good macro lens, I don't know how in focus this is, but in terms of visual effects, lichens are amazing. There's tons of species. There's lots more biodiversity to be discovered. Yeah, and so I just love these sites, and this Duncan's Cove site is my very favorite, just because I've been there the most, and you can go there a million times, and there's still more trails to explore. I always find little nooks and crannies that I've never been to before. And if you go in a different season, it looks totally different as well, right? One of the things, in midsummer, it's totally green. In the fall, you get the huckleberries. Not every year, but usually they turn that bright scarlet right before they drop their leaves. And in the winter, it becomes colorful again because you get all these purples, all the evergreen shrubs turning their colors. So it's a pretty great site. I put this picture up. This is Duncan's Cove, the other side. The last one, this is the Chebucto Head side. It's part of the same nature reserve, but this side is a Duncan's Cove side. And I put this up just to show that you have a really nice look at the two plant communities here. This is a crowberry and probably huckleberry and blueberry dominated one on the left. So that's the heathland. And then when you get closer to the ocean, you find it really kind of abruptly cuts off. And you get the salt spray zone community where those little tiny salt tolerant species like the plantain are and that kind of thing. So, and Duncan's Cove, the other thing is if you get there at the right time of year, there are tons of flowers as well. I mean, crowberry, yeah, you're not going to see them. Plus it's April if they're flying, but midsummer, there's all kinds of floral resources for pollinators, and there's tons of bees. It's a harsh environment for bees. They don't like the wind, and coastal conditions are not, typically a bee's friend, but there's still a lot of bees there. We've done a bit of work on that. And there's some rare plants at Duncan's Cove. And so we found this. It hadn't been it's in the books as being discovered in the 1970s, I think, but no one had seen it for many years. So we found it again, and it's called alpine bilberry. It's Vaccinium uliginosum. So it's an uncommon blueberry in the province. It's really common in the highlands, right? Because it really likes those Arctic or alpine conditions. So this is the farthest west and south on the mainland that you'll find it. The only other place, I mean, if you go up to Canso area, you can find it up there, and then in the highlands. The only other place is Briar Island, which of course is its own sort of special habitat. So it's really fun to find this, and we keep looking for more patches of it because I can't imagine how this rare plant can survive as only a single clump. It's actually probably about 15 feet by 15 feet. So it's not a single plant, but that's it. Like, that's really precarious. But these are long-lived perennials. It's not a very heavily disturbed environment. I try not to disturb it when I go there to take pictures of it, but yeah. So I'm gonna stop now and hopefully take some questions from the audience.
Great. That's a great overview, Jeremy. Thanks so much. I have a ton of questions. Folks, this is your opportunity. Stick your questions in the chat. We'll do our best to get to all of them tonight. I was wondering, Jeremy, just maybe to get us started, I know Emma probably has lots of questions too, but looking at your photo there got me thinking about pollinator diversity in Barrens. Could you tell us a bit about the pollinator species we might be seeing?
Yeah, there's lots of bumblebees and small bumblebees as well. So I can't remember. I'm not an insect expert. My students are studying this, but I mean, there's at least 10 bumblebee species in the province, and the insect folks in the audience can tell me exactly. But So bumblebees are something you're going to see a lot of. The other thing we see a lot of on Barrens is sweat bees. So those are little tiny bees. Some of them are bright green metallic or bluish. They're really beautiful if you can see them. The problem is they're really small. But these are some of the common species that would be pollinating things like blueberries. Blueberry is a species that it won't fertilize unless it has a buzz pollinator, and only certain bees can do that. And so bumblebees specifically are really good buzz pollinators. So especially the small ones that can get into those little flowers. Buzz pollination, basically the bee has to make a certain frequency of buzzing before the flower will release its pollen. So it's very specialized. And that's why our wild blueberry farmers, like in inland Nova Scotia, will often, rent a box of bumblebees and put it in their field if there's not enough local pollinators. So yeah, bumblebees and sweat bees, those are some of the common ones, but there are others.
Oh, cool. So how important then are wild coastal barrens for maybe Atlantic side blueberry farmers then? I imagine maybe they're carting in bees less often, or maybe we don't know.
Yeah, I mean the thing is I don't see a lot of blueberry farms on the Atlantic coast. Like I don't really see them. There might be some, but I don't see them until you get into there's some in the valley, and in the less productive areas like in the Cobequids you'll see them. Oxford is a blueberry hotspot, right? Um, so yeah, so we know that we've done some studies that show that it's the same species that pollinate the Barrens blueberries that pollinate the ones that people are cultivating or farming, the wild blueberries that people are farming, and probably the same ones that go to the high bush blueberries that are actually just cultivated as well. So yeah, there's a lot of overlap there. So we think it's an important reservoir for these species, but there's a lot more to learn.
I have a question. I was wondering about restoration of these sites because I know at a place like Duncan's Cove, there's quite a few foot trails, as
Yeah.
well as maybe in some places ATV trails crisscrossing these sites. And
Yes.
are they easy to restore? And does the fact that it's such a kind of complex mosaic, does that make it more difficult or a bit easier because you have different habitat types to choose from when you're doing the restoration?
That's a great question. So my group has done some restoration on Barrens, but it's been Highland Barrens, specifically the Skyline Trail in Cape Breton Highlands National Park. So we have had some success with putting vegetation back. Basically, they're trying to close a section of that trail, the low part, and they wanted to revegetate it because it wasn't coming back on its own. So I think there are challenges. I think Duncan's Cove is the site that I will target first for restoration around here because it has the biggest need. Like there's tons of it is eroding. Like you said, like that first section of that trail, once you get into the actual Barrens, it's terrible. Like we always walk along the coast because you're not contributing to those trails. The biggest challenge, I've done restoration work on Barrens in Ontario as well, and I think what they have in common, what I think the biggest challenge is keeping people off it while the vegetation is coming back. I think the vegetation will come back and we can plant it. So my student did some planting up in Cape Breton. That was successful. Planting actual like plants, like seedlings that we grew in a pot and then put in the ground. Those are more successful than direct seeding. Direct seeding on Barrens is more iffy. So definitely they are restorable, but what we're going to need to do to restore a site like Duncan's Cove is figure out, we're going to have to start with signage and try to really divert people away from the areas, away from the trails that we want to close. I think that's the most important thing.
Right. The plants need some space and some time, and they can.
Yeah, because if they get trampled, it's just gonna perpetuate it.
Yeah, definitely. I have a question here from the audience. So the first part is, I have aerial photos of Owl's Head from the 30s, and it looks like there were no trees at all. And walking through the park now, there seems to be a significant amount of trees. why would this be happening now in the past 100 years when I would assume it was completely barren for the previous 1,000 years? Would that be related to climate change?
Yeah, I don't know that it's related to climate change, but it could be just that there hasn't been a fire there in a long time. I wouldn't say that it's a fire requiring system. I kind of doubt it, but um, yeah, like when we do see trees encroaching, it could be that, there used to be a disturbance there, keeping it more open than it is now. But climate change, yeah, I don't think it was the cold that was keeping the trees out. It's more like soil conditions or um, things like fire. So that's a very good question. I'd love to see those photos.
I'm sure we can get them to you. Jeremy, you had a graph up in your presentation. I maybe stupidly turned it off here, from Owl's Head. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on those different communities. Part of why Owl's Head is so interesting is because it has that heterogeneous environment there. So, what are those communities that are super diverse, and where are they in elevation? And yeah.
Yeah, so I've got my screen back on the Zoom, but I don't. Anyway, what I can say is, yeah, the sites that had the most species, it's actually being driven by the heterogeneity. It's because the site is so variable. So, for example, at Owl's Head, I mean, I know it's not like if you look at the orientation of the ridges, they're not exactly north south, but close enough, right? So they've got south facing ridges, north facing ridges, the top of the ridge, and those are three distinct habitats. There's a ton of overlap in terms of the plant species that can live there. But, on average, when you sample hundreds and hundreds of these plots, sites that do have, north and south facing aspects will tend to have more plant species in them. So I think it's just the heterogeneity. We haven't looked at the different vegetation types there yet. I mean, we know what some of them are, right? And one of the rare types that's there, I mean, it's not, I shouldn't say, I mean, it's a broom crowberry community. And so broom crowberry, like I said earlier, it's kind of unique in that it's common in Nova Scotia, but any habitat, any vegetation type that incorporates broom crowberry is globally significant just because it doesn't occur anywhere else, essentially, right? So it's these rocky ridges where there's broom crowberry on top. That's very distinctive as well. I don't think we found any plant species at risk at Owl's Head. It probably needs a better inventory now that it's under threat. From our data, we didn't uncover any species at risk. Most of the Atlantic coastal barrens on the mainland of Nova Scotia, that it's great that they're protected and they're protected for good reasons, but there's not a ton of plant species at risk on them. So it's not like the Atlantic coastal plain flora, which, some of these are listed federally as species at risk, and you can get funding. You can, there's legislation that can protect these, but Owl's Head doesn't have a lot of plant species that fit that category, right? Well, I don't think it has any rare, like I should say, it doesn't have any species at risk on the plant side. So that's why our activists are looking at things like the eelgrass, which is super significant. Eelgrass beds offshore are, would be highly impacted by a golf course or anything like that. So yeah, it's the heterogeneity in my mind from a plant perspective that makes it a really interesting site.
Nova Scotia has a lot of species that I guess we could consider to be rare, even though they're not listed at risk. Maybe for folks in our audience who aren't as familiar with like a listing process federally or provincially, could we elaborate on that a bit? What does that mean for conservation for a species that is globally rare, say, but not officially listed? And what does that say about how we do conservation, I guess, in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, I mean, the system, we've got two systems, right? Or more than two, but we've got the federal listing. So things that are nationally rare can be listed with COSEWIC and hopefully eventually get listed under the species at risk legislation at the federal level. That provides some protection. It requires a recovery plan. You've got to have a status report, and then you have to do a recovery plan. Species at risk that are provincial species at risk, for example, a species that's really rare in Nova Scotia but might be super common in Quebec, that's not going to be a nationally listed species, but it could still be a highly threatened or endangered species in Nova Scotia. And so that's why we have the provincial species at risk legislation as well. And again, I'm involved with that process. I'm not involved with the federal stuff as much, but I am on the plant recovery team for Nova Scotia. And so essentially, once something gets listed, the province is required to come up with a recovery plan for that species. So things like black ash are listed. A lot of the Atlantic coastal plain flora is listed. There is one Barrens, well, probably a couple Barrens species that on the provincial list. One of them's on inland sand barrens, and that's the rock rose, Canada rock rose. So that's been listed, and we're working on the recovery plan. It hasn't been officially approved yet, but it's articulated and underway. So that's happening. But we don't get that on the coast.
Right. We've got lots of questions from the audience coming in here, so maybe I'll ask a few of those.
Yeah.
So Tanya's asking, given the dominance of bog and wetland patches in the Barrens, are there any estimates of the carbon storage potential? Do we know how deep the peat areas are?
We don't, but that's a great question. And it's something I've always wanted to get at because, I mean, the peatlands are one thing, and they probably do store quite a bit of carbon. When we've done, we were only doing this to figure out sort of soil depth, like how much soil did the plants have to grow in. And when we get those little bog patches, just the little tiny ones, it'll go over a meter, right? So, there is storage there. The other thing about the Barrens and carbon is that it's not a very productive system. And so on the one hand, it doesn't produce a lot of biomass. So that's kind of on the negative side of carbon storage. But it's being an unproductive system, there's also probably very little decomposition. It's also the nature of the plant litter that comes from these ericaceous shrubs. It's what we call recalcitrant. It's really hard to break down, and it tends to sit there for a long period of time. So I imagine these are pretty good carbon storage areas. Maybe not like salt marshes, which are probably really, really good. We're working on that too. That's a whole other story. But I think it's probably significant, and it's something that we should be looking at in terms of an overall, carbon budget, and it should be something we think about in terms of protecting these barren habitats.
Awesome. All right. Next question here is back to Owl's Head. So the prospective developer of Owl's Head Provincial Park has claimed that the development of golf courses and residential communities will protect and enhance the site's natural ecosystems. Can you explain in more detail how the blasting, infilling, and monoculture required for golf courses would affect the coastal barrens?
Yeah, there's a couple things. There's, first of all, I mean, it depends on where on that site they're going to do this, but they will be replacing whatever vegetation was there for the area that's actually going to be the golf course is going to be replaced. So that's lost, right? The other main impact is what happens to the adjacent barrens. Golf courses are known to be, they use a lot of pesticides, which is not great for our, barrens, insects, and things like that. They use a ton of fertilizer to keep those golf greens where they're supposed to be. They have to use a lot of that. So that can run off. It can get into the water system, which is why the eelgrass beds are threatened by this potentially. I've heard tales of, ecologically friendly golf courses, but I haven't seen any examples of those in Nova Scotia. It's a pretty high impact land use. So it boggles the mind to think that someone thinks they can build a golf course like that. But I mean, yeah. So there's basically just those two categories of effects.
Makes sense. Are there invasive species issues? I'm guessing this question is with barrens in general.
Yeah.
In Terrence Bay, for example, there's a significant amount of Japanese knotweed. How likely is this to spread into the barrens habitat in that wilderness area?
Yeah. So, and okay, first of all, the nice thing about barrens is there's not a lot of invasive species. There's not a lot of species that can actually invade. Um, there's definitely a bunch of weeds that will show up in what I would call disturbed barrens. So on these rock outcrops where people like to sit and have picnics, you can see little clovers and things like that. Those aren't really invasive. They're only occurring in that disturbed area and they're not spreading into adjacent areas. Japanese knotweed is the only one that I've ever been concerned about on barrens. There might be some others, um, but what we see, you can see a bunch of it at Crystal Crescent as well. It's mainly in sort of a shrubland area, more like a tall shrub area, not really a true coastal barren at that point. Um, there's one patch of Japanese knotweed right near the lighthouse at Chebucto Head. It's been there for years. I think it was brought in on equipment that was used to dig, when they built another one of those cell towers. Again, it's been there for at least 10 years. It is stunted and is not spreading onto the actual barrens. And so I just don't think, I mean, there's tons of, I live in Halifax, so I see Japanese knotweed all over the place. And it has, it likes rich soils, it likes wet conditions. And so I think probably the only areas at risk on barrens might be those seeps where there's drainage, where you see a lot of cinnamon fern. So that's another type we have on the barrens, and they're always following, either actual streams or underground, like groundwater flow. That would be an area that might be at risk from Japanese knotweed, but I haven't seen it in those actual areas. So I think it's wise to be concerned, but I honestly have not seen a lot of barrens where Japanese knotweed has actually been able to get in there. It's just the wrong type of soil. It's the wrong type of conditions.
Interesting. Someone is tuning in from the Annapolis Valley. Do you have any recommendations for barren sites to visit in that area? I think this person is from Halls Harbor.
Okay, yeah. There are, I was going to say sand barrens. The sand barrens that are easy to see, you can see them on the side of the highway. Greenwood area, down that way. That's a great place to see those. Coastal barrens, just the wrong part of the province for coastal barrens. Trying to think. Cape Split's got some great rock outcrops, but those are more cliff habitats, right? And you don't want to go on those. So that's not. Yeah, sorry, I'm at a bit of a loss. It's a sand. The Annapolis Valley has the sand barrens, and that's where we have most of our sand barrens. Mersey, like the Tobiatic Wilderness area, like some of the inland barrens are down that way. A lot of them are inaccessible, so they're not. You have to know where they are. So it's not like, oh yeah, drive up, here's a parking lot, and go onto an inland barren. But I can give you tons of recommendations on the Atlantic side. There's tons, right? There's so many. So
cool, thank you. Well, the sand barrens are a pretty unique place, so it's a good place to start.
Yeah.
We can probably put together a list for folks afterwards. We'll share to our socials. We can come up with a list of barrens you might want to visit there that are safe too. We've got a question here about Peggy's Cove, because we're kind of jumping around the province here. There's so many cool barrens to talk about.
Yeah.
From Philip, who's saying he heard that back in 1970, a guy in Prospect told me that the area around Peggy's Cove had been deforested about 100 years ago by firewood harvesting. Is that true or false?
There was a large wildfire about 100 years ago in the Peggy's Cove area. So that's one of the areas we know has burned. I hadn't heard about firewood harvesting, but it's possible. It's possible. It's also possible. I mean, that could have happened at Owl's Head too, in terms of, a human disturbance that's creating more barrens just because of getting rid of trees than would be there naturally. So I hadn't heard that one, but it's definitely an area that has had natural disturbance, like huge wildfires. There's a map from back in, I don't know, 1910 or something, and a large part of the Peggy's Cove area was hit by wildfire. But yeah, we'll file that away. I think that's very interesting, and it'd be great to hear if other sites had that same kind of land use, if people are actually cutting trees and that kind of thing.
Local stories can be so interesting. I guess some folks might not know why we call Barrens Barrens. Jeremy, is it true that when we're thinking about Barrens, we're talking about areas that traditionally were viewed as being physically barren or barren of trees? Because we know from your talk that they're actually
Yeah,
quite diverse.
that's that's a great question, and it's something. It's actually a terrible name for this habitat because it's anything but barren. There's so much biodiversity there, right? But I mean, I think it does reflect. Um, Barren means it doesn't have forest on it, essentially, and in a province where forest was such an important resource, barrens were considered to be useless, and people would pick berries on them, but that's about it, right? And so it reflects that economic view of nature, unfortunately. So heathlands sound nice, but not everyone, if I say heathland to someone, like, what is that? But we, in some of our work, we've defined barrens as having less than 15% tree cover over a large area, but not everyone agrees with that. And there are certainly trees on them too. Closer to the coast you get, they're stunted, right? They're little tiny trees. Polly's Cove has this great, pine trees don't like to grow close to the ocean. They're not as salt tolerant as spruce. And you'll see on the side of the highway, in March at the end of the winter, the pines are all turning red because of all the salt from the winter for snow clearing and stuff like that. But the spruces are fine. But there's this one white pine tree at Polly's Cove that's growing essentially horizontally. It's one of my favorite trees. It doesn't look like a pine at all. So there are still trees there, but yeah, barrens.
And ecosystems in flux too, I guess. Sometimes trees, sometimes not. Tricky.
Yeah.
Funny, Emma and I actually worked on a project together trying to translate a number of wetland-related words into Arabic for a new Canadian guide. And barren was a really tricky one. I think we ended up calling them upland bogs or something similar to that in a literal
That's
translation, which
awesome.
is also very tricky. So,
Yeah.
what would you call them, I guess, if you could rename barrens today?
Well, I mean, we in the classification, we kind of had the task of renaming them, right? And so we call them shrublands. Dwarf shrublands for the short ones. I don't really like that term, but it's kind of better. It's better than barrens in a way. The other thing I'll point out is I've been compiling a list from Mi'kmaq sources of names for plants, obviously, and there's lots of names for the barrens plants, but I haven't been able to find a name for barrens themselves. Right? There's the Listigooj wing of the Mi'kmaq people up in Quebec. They have a word for, it's like the top of a mountain where there's no trees. There is a word for that, but I don't know if anyone in Nova Scotia in this part of Mi'kmaq ever used that term, and it certainly doesn't come up in any of the sources that I've seen. And so I'd love to know that if there is a word for that, but
Yeah, interesting. If anyone knows, let us know, 'cause that would be cool to know about. I don't think that there's a local Mi'kmaq word for a wetland either. Emma, do you know? I think we're thinking more like more.
Actually, I asked someone that, and she said the closest she could think of in that moment was place where your shoes get wet, which I thought was
because
pretty
I
good.
I work in salt marshes as well. I have been collecting words about that, and let me just. Sorry, I got my database open right now. There's definitely, I mean, there's words for pretty much everything, but there is a word for sort of that translates as wilderness or desert or barren. Gatuk, gatuk. Yeah, wetlands that's a tricky one. There's all kinds of words about tides and things like that, so we know. I mean, yeah, I do have a couple words for wetland or swamp, and there's a separate one for black spruce swamp. So these were known habitats that were, considered separate. So I do have those words if anyone's interested. I have a big database here, but yeah.
I guess we're getting pretty close to 8 here, Emma. Do you see any questions in our chat that we haven't addressed yet? If not,
someone just asked if there are many species of orchids found in coastal barrens, and I know you mentioned one of them, the bog orchid there.
Yeah, there's quite a few. There are quite a few. We see sometimes the spiranthes in some of the drier areas. Well, not too dry, but so those are the ladies' tresses. They tend to flower more like August, September, I'm going to say. And there's a few species of those. So those pop up sometimes. The bog orchids, there's three fairly common ones. There's rose begonia, grass pink, and the dragon's mouth. So those three, they're all kind of the same color, but the flowers are slightly different shapes. And I think the one near Halifax that's most common in our barrens is the dragon's head. So those are really common. There are others, and I've seen some as well. Sometimes, the forest islands, I tend to ignore them because they're hard to walk through. Like, they're not great for hikers, right? You kind of have to crawl on your belly, and once you're in, some of the trees are very short, so they're hard to get into. But there are other orchids that sometimes live in those areas. Yeah, like some of the Liparis I've seen in there. But those are the ones I mentioned, the bog orchids, those pink ones are the ones that I see most often.
Definitely get a wildflower book, folks, and get out to some coastal barrens and have a look. There's a couple out at Polly's Cove area right now if you're hoping to see some. Well, I guess I don't want to go too much beyond 8 here. Maybe we can wrap up with just a quick discussion about disturbance regimes here. We've chatted a bit about just the cool plants that we can find and why development would be so detrimental, especially around Owl's Head, to the unique ecosystems we're finding here. What about these inland barrens? Why is fire so prominent in these spaces, and what does that mean for development around inland barrens, Jeremy?
Yeah, there's a great example of development right up to the edge of one of these inland barrens, up in Spryfield, actually. I've got some pictures. It would take me a while to find the pictures, but I think we've experienced this in Halifax. There was a huge fire that it wasn't just inland barrens that it burned, but forest as well. The Herring Cove fire in 2010, and so people's houses were damaged by the fire. And that is a fire system. It's got a jack pine all over the ridge. And so if people want to develop these areas, it's just like areas in California, they're developing into a system that naturally has some kind of fire regime. So periodically fires are going to come. And so that's a risk so people shouldn't be building there. I mean, I think that's one take on that, but it's certainly a risk. But the reason fire is so common is it's a combination of fuel load. There are some trees and there's shrubs. So if they dry out, they burn. And even if they burn quite superficially, what happens, it'll kill off the above ground parts, but then they resprout, right? The Herring Cove fire, a lot of the jack pines haven't come back. So it killed the jack pine, but there's tons of regeneration of jack pine, right? So that's a plant that does very well with fire. And other species, sort of uncommon or rare species, also came back after that fire because they actually like those conditions. It kills off their competitors, and then they spring up. So things like broom crowberry and golden heather, which is actually a rare species in the province, but quite common on some barrens. There was tons of that coming up after the fire, probably more than before the fire. So yeah, it's dry, rocky, not a lot of soil, not a lot of places for moisture to be stored in the soil. So that's what makes an inland barren fire prone.
That might be a good question for the answer for the question that Beverly just asked, which is, what would you say to people who believe the lands of Owl's Head are wastelands and who don't see value in them? I guess your house not burning down is one.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the thing. There's a lot of natural habitats in this province that were used by Mi'kmaq people, and they appreciated, the plants that were there. They knew they could find certain plants that were medicine plants or berry plants or whatever. And so settlers don't necessarily have that same view. And so barrens are barrens, right? They aren't considered to have value. And I mean, if you just look at the economic value of Owl's Head, it's probably quite low, right? It's not doing much for them, or at least not in a conventional economic sense. If we talk about ecosystem services, it's doing all kinds of stuff, right? It's a reservoir for biodiversity. It's storing carbon, maybe not as much as an old growth forest, but it's still storing some. And especially all those peatlands, all those wetland patches, there's probably quite a bit of peat deposits in at least a part of that site that could have long-term large amounts of carbon storage. So, I mean, they're also reservoirs for pollinators. If anyone grows tomatoes, I know, for example, my next door neighbor, when I started my native plant garden in the front, she said she got better pollination of her tomatoes because I guess there's more bees because I had more wildflowers and everyone else just had lawns. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things that any given patch of natural habitat does for humanity. And that's why the whole ecosystem services concept came about, is try to convince people that, just because you're not getting a dollar value from it doesn't mean it's worth nothing. But that's a tough argument. Rural Nova Scotia, especially Eastern Shore, not a lot of jobs, not a lot of economic development. So it's a really hard argument. It's not a simple thing.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Eastern Shore definitely hasn't had the wave of ecotourism either. The South Shore has. So maybe that's something we can change, Beverly. Well, we better wrap it up here, folks. We've gone a little bit over 8. But if you have any more questions, I mean, definitely reach out. If you're following us on social media, you can ask questions about coastal barrens there. We'll make sure that we put you in touch with Jeremy. I did see a question here, Jeremy, that we actually didn't get to. Someone asked when you were planning on going out to the Owl's Head area next. I'm assuming they're looking for a tour, so that might be something we'll have to set up at some point when things are safer.
I don't. I know there were some people trying to go during the pandemic just to get some more, like a BioBlitz kind of thing, and so we can find any rare plants. I don't have any plans to go back at this point. Access is challenging, and now that the local community seems to be, unhappy about people who want to preserve it as a nature reserve, it's a little iffy. So I don't have any plans at this point.
We'll let you know, folks. Definitely itching to get outside over here at Nature Nova Scotia too. So thanks so much for being with us, Jeremy, and thank you, Emma, again for being here and moderating all of our questions.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for the great questions.
Yeah, thanks for your questions, folks. So we are going to be back here in almost exactly a month. So if you've joined us before, you know the drill. We do this every month. Next month is, I think, going to be about turtles. So tune in the first Tuesday of next month. We're going to be joined by a researcher looking at turtles in Nova Scotia. And then I don't think we've decided on a topic for, will the month after that be September, but we'll have one. So make sure you're following us on social media. If you haven't signed up to our email list, definitely do. Jeremy, if there's anywhere folks can follow your work, maybe if you can send that to me, I can make sure it gets out on our socials and out to our email list as well, so folks can follow along. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give that some thought. Yes.
Okay, great. All right, folks. Well, have a good night.